here, and if he's helping you folks out, that's really terrific. He should be doing a great job. But these are some of the resources. All of these are available through the League's website. Some more things that are available through the League's website. And Melissa Milton Pung, who I'll get to some of her slides in a moment, she did a really terrific PowerPoint to the Michigan Mayors Association last August. And I would guess it was at least 2 or 3 hours long. And I just took a few of her slides that we'll get to, but she has a lot of expertise and in perhaps even more importance, can hook you up with others who can help as well if you need it. In regard to housing, and I don't know if affordable housing is a particular issue here or not, but I found this, it's fairly recent, from 2018 up in Grand Haven, and they put together a task force and they were trying to deal with the affordability of housing and the concerns, as you see here, 1, 2, and 3. And these were the ideals. And it may be that here in South Haven, you would come up with other objectives or ideals. These are the ones that they did and came up with in Grand Haven. Everyone who works in Grand Haven should be able to live there. They would like to have a variety of housing options, and you ought to be able to age in place. That was what they were shooting for, and so they came up with those ideals, and then they made recommendations to the City Council of Grand Haven, and these are among the recommendations they made. And there were a lot of specifics with respect to financial incentives that the city could help utilize. There was a call for supporting higher density development in certain districts, which can help. They called for working regionally with some of the other communities around Grand Haven. And the last one is taking a look at the zoning ordinances to promote affordable houses. And this is an important topic. The zoning is often challenged in some communities because it's viewed as being too restrictive. And I mean, and I'm not saying that as a fact, but it's a value judgment, obviously. But those who feel that a goal that should be achieved as affordable housing can articulate certain zoning practices with respect not allowing accessory units or minimum floor areas or lot widths that tend to increase the minimum amount of expense for a house. And they would argue that if you're trying to achieve more affordable housing, you need to take a look at your zoning practices, at least in certain areas. This is the part of the economic development presentation that I mentioned that Melissa had done. She called it Strategic Economic Development for Your Community's Backstory, or with your community's backstory. And it has a lot to do with the Municipal League's efforts in regard to place. The League has, for the last number of years, put together a lot of materials and done a lot of work in regard to trying to articulate the importance of place. And that's kind of a nebulous phrase, but it's, I guess, I believe it at least. I think it's something that once you get attuned to it, I think it can be helpful in the future development of a community. So, where is your favorite place? And I think what she was asking is visualize a place within South Haven that you really like, or maybe another community that just impressed you. A lot of it's physical. You know, the building is beautiful, the streets are nice, the lights are nice, whatever it may be. If it has a real positive impression upon you, you want to be there. And your community certainly has a lot of that attractiveness already. You're very lucky in that regard. But anyway, where is your favorite place? What do you like about this place? Oops, we're missing some slides. Well, that'll move us along more quickly. So let me see if I can find them in my overly lengthy. Okay. So what do you like about this place? Some of the concepts are think in your mind's eye what some of the characteristics that define this place. How does it make you feel? What great memories do you have there? Highlight the themes that you hear. Physical beauty, aesthetics of a place, people watching activities, cool local businesses, great food, walkability. And like I say, South Haven already has a lot of these attributes. But the idea is, with this sort of initiative, is to think about those sorts of things. What attracts you? Why do you want to be there? Why do you want to go visit there? Why would you like to go back to that place, whether it's in your town or another town? And then try to find ways to do more of it, basically. Think about what was there before. You need to know your history. What stories can be told? What's no longer there? Is that a problem? What is obscured? What can you bring out and make more prominent? You know, maybe the most obvious sort of thing is a building. One of the things that I've noticed in a great many communities, I was just in Detroit over the weekend with my wife. We just wanted to go down to the Detroit Institute of Arts, and we decided we wanted to stay at a hotel that we had seen when we were at the Jazz Festival last summer. It's called the Siren Hotel. It was the old Wurlitzer building, and somebody decided they were going to save it, and they've turned it into a boutique hotel. It's just a neat place. One of the neat aspects is when you walk in, they've left part of the original ceiling the way it used to be before they renovated it, so you can see what had been there. And so somebody had the idea that the Wurlitzer building, and it has a great backstory, was something worth saving. And one of the good news aspects of Detroit is that, unfortunately, the downturn was so significant for so long, nothing happened, but a lot of things weren't torn down, thank goodness, because the planners would say that Detroit and a lot of communities in Michigan have good bones. The basic buildings are really good, and to the extent they still exist, they can be repurposed. And if you think about what the stories are, people respond to the stories of what used to be there. If you can save it and redo it and make it, repurpose it, and use it again, people really respond to that. And it brings an additional element to the history of the community as well. How are good cities built up? Good places, good cities happen not by accident, by layering, by championing, by knowing your backstory and incorporating it or differentiating it, by conscious choices and planning. And again, I think especially in Michigan cities, the buildings that have been there for a long time and can be repurposed are terrific. I just see those all over the state. What about your community's future history? I like that phrase, future history, because you're going to be writing it as the city council members, as the members of boards and commission. You're going to be writing that future history. What do you admire? Figure out what you admire or what those who you are seeking to attract admire. This is a photograph of a block in Ann Arbor that I can remember way back when I was an undergrad. That was not a very desirable street. It was probably considered dangerous, although it really wasn't dangerous. But it was in an area that had been neglected for a long, long time. Well, you know, obviously in Ann Arbor, everything is turned around downtown. It's very lucky in that regard, but somebody bought these buildings. They weren't torn down. Somebody bought them and have redone them, and now it's a very successful block. And putting it all together, local inventory prioritization, what are your next steps? Go from you could to here's how. Start with collaboration among your boards and commissions and those within the community. Engage your experts, realtors, anyone who has a good business sense, I would say. Be specific. Highlight assets. Use the data. Identify barriers to redevelopment and ways to overcome them. And be realistic. It is a long game. And Mr. Hedinger would be able to speak to this a lot better than I, and I imagine those on your boards, commissions can as well. I mean, it takes a long time. But if once you get it headed in the right direction, I think people will, even more than they are already, want to be here, and development will follow. And given, this is typically where I might take a break, I think we ought to keep moving. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay, I'm going to jump into some of the more substantive, I guess, legalistic aspects of the presentation. Both the First Amendment, social media, and Sunshine Acts, all of those, I think they tie together pretty well. The most interesting aspect to me, at least, is the interaction between all of these and what we all have right next to us, probably, our smartphones. It's totally changed the way we do everything. To some extent for the better, to some extent not maybe so much, but let's get into it. So the First Amendment protects the public's right to disagree with government in whatever forum. At a council meeting, and you may hear that in the public comment portion, at a city park, and now on social media. I don't mind admitting that I'm not very active on social media. If I have to keep up with a niece or nephew, I'm going to be looking at Facebook. But otherwise, I have lots of things to do with my time. But that's not what a whole lot of people are doing. And I think that however one might feel about social media, I think it is something that really absolutely needs to be paid attention to at the municipal level. But in regard to First Amendment issues, generally you can't delete or hide negative comments or block someone from your page. I assume the city has a page? Yes. Okay. So which of these can you ban? Inappropriate comments, inflammatory posts, colorful language, hate speech, posts that hold a person to public ridicule, criticism of your city? None. Remember I said sometimes after public comment, you just have to say, your comment is noted, thank you very much. This is sort of an analogous situation. Unfortunately, or fortunately, these can't be banned. So what can you ban? Well, you can ban some things. And you need to get an opinion from your city attorney, but generally I would suggest you can ban obscene sexual and pornographic content, threats to a person, for instance. You can't advocate or support political campaigns. So these are some of the things that you can do with respect to your page. But it's a little bit tough that you might think that it's your page and you would like to remove certain things, but I'd be careful in so doing, and I'd work with your city attorney to make sure that you're on safe ground in doing so if you're trying to remove something. With respect to elected officials, Personal social media activities, if tied to your governmental duties, could be a public forum and subject to the First Amendment and OMA and FOIA. Employees, there are some rules with respect to employees. Excessive use of social media at work, individual gripes about the boss, illegal personal social media activities. You can't violate the social media policy. So those are some things that you need to make sure that you are making your employees aware of, but do be cautious and work with your city attorney, and he or she may want to touch base with someone in employment law to make sure that you're not being too restrictive. Why social media? I took this from a presentation I saw at the Municipal League's conference last year. It was someone from the village of Holly. And we had some really good presentations on social media. The persons who were presenting, by and large, were relatively young, relatively new to their jobs in city government, very irreverent, very bright, and I thought it was really incredibly effective. Again, I'm not a big social media user, but I totally respect the opportunity that it gives a city, especially after hearing these presentations. So here are some of the reasons that why it's important that Katie mentioned. It's free and it's easy. Communicating with your residents is vital. Social media is quickly replacing the daily newspaper, and I think that's true. It's unfortunate. In Ann Arbor, the Ann Arbor News publishes a print version twice a week. It's not great. My wife wonders why on earth we still get it, but we do. But unfortunately, that's the way of the world. The print media it's very tough to continue to operate a newspaper, but social media is always there, and people are paying attention to it. Residents will go to your page to get their news about the city. It allows you to have consistent messaging, and you control the narrative. So you get to say what you want to have them hear about your city. She would say, post on Facebook at least once a day. Pictures are worth 1,000 words. I totally believe in that. People will respond to pictures. Cross-post Instagram and Facebook photos, okie dokie. So I'm sure you're all on Instagram. Use appropriate emojis and add a few hashtags at the end of a post. And do you have a communications person who is, okay. So these sorts of things are things that can really influence how the public is viewing how you are running the city. Here are some of our suggestions for Facebook posts. Put up community events and activities, business spotlights, grand openings. Give a shout out to a new business or somebody that's doing something special in your business community. Anything positive. So be community-minded, tell your story, change the culture, enhance communication. So tell your story, I think, is key. That's a megaphone. It's your megaphone. So this is from somebody from Ferndale, and she was very irreverent and very good in what she was telling us. And her first question was, who owns your social media? And there she is. And that was her point. She owns them, because she's in charge of it. Ultimately, of course, the city council is in charge and the city manager, but they have given to her the reins. And so when she asks who owns your social media, in Ferndale's case, it's that particular person, and she's very aggressive in doing it. If we don't know our audience, we risk saying just what we want to say, how we want to say it, without considering how they'll hear it. And her point there was, I believe, that you have what you're thinking and how you would like to express it. but your audience may be hearing it in a very different way. You need to consider your audience, and it may be very different than what you're thinking, but you need to communicate in terms that they will understand and appreciate and really listen to. As I mentioned, she was pretty irreverent. This is Ferndale's journey to not sucking. Listen. It's 100% more important than communicating. Number 2, seek the why. Why does someone hate a project that you're doing? Are you afraid you'll lose the character of your neighborhood, lose parking, property values will decline? Ferndale is really an evolving community. It's got a lot going on, but it's changing very dramatically. Be real. People's interest in dealing with city government of Ferndale is a lot lower than their interest in dealing with Kara. With her. Go where the people are. This one's really important. So her point is that if there are media platforms where people are, it's like if you knew everybody in the city or a huge group of people in the city were going to be at the high school gymnasium, you'd want to be there. I think her point is that people are on certain sites. They are active on these sites. That's where they're communicating. That's where they're getting their impressions of what Ferndale is doing and the good things that Ferndale is doing. So her point was, you need to be where they are. And if they are on certain social media platforms, then you need to be active there. Because you've got a great story to tell. I took out a bunch of slides, but why on earth is that person there? Well, I'll try to be quick, but he was the code enforcement officer that had been going around the city and giving people violation notices for weeds that were too tall, where they hadn't cut their grass on the medians or something like that. Well, through their program, through the social media, they were actually able to make Colin a star. And rather than him being this negative person who's going around issuing tickets to people, they made fun of him, and he got into it, and he made fun of himself, and they ended up with T-shirts of hashtag Make Colin Proud. I think he gave him a ticket to himself at some point in time because his grass was too high, whatever. It didn't make any difference, but the point is they had fun with it, and the people appreciated it. And rather than being sort of a negative thing that the city was doing, it ended up being a very positive thing that the city was doing. And everybody appreciated the fact that he was going around the city trying to make it aesthetically nicer. So again, your community is engaging somewhere. Find them, join them, and the results will follow. Okay. Moving right along. The Sunshine Acts, unless there are any questions. There are 2 Sunshine Acts in Michigan. The first is FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act. The second is OMA, the Open Meetings Act. And in both instances, the key is the policy. If you have a sense of the policy of OMA and FOIA, you will basically take a shortcut to finding the answer that you need. Or at least you'll pause a moment and think, maybe I should ask one of my colleagues. Maybe I should ask the manager. Maybe I should ask the manager to inquire of the city attorney so we can get some more specific direction. So the policy is really the key. If you understand the policy of each of these, I think you'll get a good sense of how you can avoid any difficulties. And of course, I've got a disclaimer, and that is that there's no substitute for consulting with your city attorney who can interpret the law in the context of your community. The origin of FOIA and OMA. This is the origin. That's Richard Milhouse Nixon. And that's 1974, and while he is looking very happy in this photograph, he is actually on the White House lawn about ready to helicopter away after leaving office after the Watergate scandal. So it's not a particularly happy moment for him. But why is this important? Well, it's important for two reasons. One, because it was Watergate, and secondly, because it's 1974. Watergate was a scandal, and 1974 was a long time ago. 1974 was a long time before smartphones existed. I don't even know if Steve Jobs was born in 1974, let alone had invented a smartphone. So after the Watergate scandal, all around the country, states, including Michigan, put in place statutes to try to deal with the perceived abuses from the Watergate scandal. So we have the Open Meetings Act and the Freedom of Information Act. Each were effective in 1977. Again, a long, long time ago. I'm not sure how you feel, which one of these pictures you feel is more appropriate for how you feel, but some municipal officials feel as though they're hamstrung by these two acts, and the news media at least feel that it's a happy sunshine. They are the Sunshine Acts. It's transparency. The fact of the matter is that both OMA and FOIA are somewhat constricting, and it's difficult for elected officials, especially because elected officials are great communicators. One of the things that you do very well, and I would say anyone on a board or commission, it would be the same thing. One of the things that you do very well is communicate with people, and the reality is that both of these acts do put some constraints on communication. So I mentioned the policy is key. This is the policy of FOIA. Persons are entitled to full and complete information regarding the affairs of government and the official acts of those who represent them. The people shall be informed so that they may fully participate in the democratic process. That's very unusual language for a statute. But persons, unless you're in jail, are entitled to full and complete information. The people shall be informed. Unusual language, very aspirational. And the courts enforce it that way, and oftentimes they will quote that language. So what must you provide under FOIA? Well, you have to provide a public record. Well, what's a public record? Well, it's a writing, which is prepared, owned, used, in the possession of, or retained by a public body in the performance of an official function. But whereas when these were written and enacted, a writing would have been on a piece of paper, now it includes email, it includes text messages, in some instances, drafts and notes. But it definitely includes emails and text messages are included. There are exceptions. The legislature did a good job in articulating some exceptions which make sense. These are some of the exceptions. Bids. It makes sense that if bids were subject to FOIA, it wouldn't be a good bid process. Test questions and answers. The police department would have trouble doing a sergeant's exam if the candidates could FOIA the questions beforehand. Tentative bargaining agreements, Crime Victims' Rights Act, that is to prevent rather sad people from doing what they used to do, which was FOIAing photographs, grisly photographs of crime scenes. Something that is subject to attorney-client privilege, that can also be an exception. Other possible exceptions, invasion of privacy. You might think that, well, that's personal. That shouldn't be subject to FOIA. Well, in actuality, personnel records are generally not exempt. Something, if the municipality claims that something is not subject to FOIA because it's an invasion of privacy, you have to meet a fairly strict two-part test to be able to not release it. You have a FOIA coordinator, and he or she can work with the manager and with the, or are you the FOIA coordinator as well? Oh, congratulations. Can work with the, with the city attorney if you need any help. In some communities, it is really quite something. City of Ann Arbor, I think, has an assistant city attorney that does nothing but to deal with FOIA requests, incredibly expensive. Police records, you might think that police records would not be subject to FOIA. Well, in actuality, operational ones, for instance, who are the undercover officers, obviously those are exempt. But investigative and personnel records, you still must satisfy a test to not release them, to be able to say that they can't be released. So, in regard to today's technology, email clearly falls within the definition of a writing. So, any email which is prepared, owned, used in the possession of, or retained by a public body in the performance of an official function would be subject to FOIA. Okay, email is subject to FOIA. Okay, but what if it's on your personal smartphone? What if it's on your home computer? Well, there's not an absolutely definitive answer on that. This was something that was posted on the municipal attorney's listserv a while back. And the question was, what if a city receives an FOIA for all the text or email messages of all the city council members to and from the city manager on their personal smartphones? And this is what a city attorney posted and asked for reactions from city attorneys from around the state. And here are some of the responses. Don't worry, you can relax. If the documents don't exist in the records of the city, there's your answer. And the point there was, since these were on personal smartphones, those emails or text messages never went through the server in the city. And that first responder said, don't worry about it. You know, it's not something that the city has to be concerned with. The second person said essentially the same thing. My knee-jerk reaction is, since these are not city-provided phones and the city doesn't pay for their service, they are not records as envisioned by FOIA. So those two persons said, don't worry about it. The reason I highlighted this third response is because I think this is a more correct, or at least a cautious or safe way to proceed. I think there's a strong argument that emails between two members of a public body concerning city business constitute public records under FOIA, regardless of the fact that they were created on a personal device, because they are creating, possessing, and using records for an official function. So here's an attempt at humor. If a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, doesn't make a sound. So if you are exchanging, or if council members are exchanging emails on personal devices, it never goes through the city server. Is that like a tree that falls in the forest and it doesn't make a sound? Or no one's around to hear it, doesn't make a sound? I would suggest that it's not where it was stored. It's more about what is stored. And by that I mean it's less about the particular device that you're using, whether it's a smartphone, your personal smartphone, or your home computer, and more about what the emails are about, or the text messages. If they're about city business, then I think you should be concerned that they would be subject to FOIA. Now, granted, if they never come through the city system, it may be that no one will be aware. But they ultimately could be. I'd be very cautious. Now, as soon as I say something really definitive like that, the attorney in me wants to let you know that here are a couple examples of cases from the Court of Appeals that kind of went the other direction a little bit. But to be safe, again, I think you should keep in mind that particular decision from the Howell School Board and be concerned that it's not where it's stored, but rather what sort of information is being exchanged by council members. In sum, 1976 laws colliding with 21st century technology. Those are the legislators trying to figure out what happened. Ripped from the pages of the case books, This is a particular case from a number of years ago. What if a city council member or chamber, the video camera was left on? So city council chamber, the video camera recorder was left on, as in this chamber. The mayor adjourns the meeting. Some of the council members are still talking. The tape was still running. And somebody in the public says, I want a copy of that videotape. It's City Hall, it's city council members, city technology. We ought to have that subject to FOIA. They took it to court. Court said, no, you don't get it. And the reason is because even though, again, where it was all about the city, and even the who, the court apparently listened to it and said that no official city business was being conducted. So maybe the council members were talking about the football game that Friday, or something that was not related to city business. So it was not subject to FOIA. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip this very long one, but you've got it in your materials if you wish. And get to question number 3. If a council member requests something, should he or she file a FOIA request? And I don't know Brian, do you have a?
We would not require a FOIA request.
Okay. And there's no right or wrong on this one. It's an interesting question, and I get some good arguments sometimes when I make presentations, even among council members. And a lot of communities do what you do here. No, there's no reason to do it. But there are arguments on both sides as to, should the public have to pay if the city council members don't have to pay, is one argument. And this is an interesting thing. The city attorney in Muskegon posted this. This is what they do. And he asks the council as a whole, if the majority want the document, all that want it get it without cost. If not, the individual member goes through the FOIA process, including any fee. But at the end of the day, it's up to local discretion. There's no right or wrong. And it's best set forth in a rule or a policy. As long as there's a common understanding, I think that's great. And that's the end of FOIA. We can move into the Open Meetings Act, unless there are any questions on FOIA. Yes, sure.
So like Wendy and I are both on Parks Commission.
Okay.
What if we happen to be outside of any kind of official meeting, we run into each other and we talk about something related to parks? Are we allowed to do that?
If you see each other, you should run away as fast as we're going to get into it to some extent in the Open Meetings Act. That's one of the difficult situations with respect to, to being on a commission or certainly a council. And the answer is no, you don't have to avoid people. I think it's important to understand the appearance. If most of the council is at a particular location before or after a council meeting, you may be not talking about city business at all, but keep in mind what the appearance may be for the public. So no, you don't have to avoid each other. But you should be cognizant of the sorts of things that you were discussing, and we'll get into it in the Open Meetings Act. Yeah.
Just as a follow-up to that, as you sit here, probably not that many people aside from Grant think a whole lot about our fire services board. But the reality is we have a quorum of the fire services board in this room completely unintentionally. Ross Stein, Mayor Smith, and myself make up a quorum of the fire services board. What you'll observe tonight is there's going to be pleasantries. I'm going to say hi to Ross and thank him for coming, but we're likely going to avoid any and all discussion of fire services, just solely for appearances. And that's one of those small town moments where you can try real hard to make sure that you don't have these types of situations, but the benefit of having township supervisor in the room to receive training is far greater than the potential downside of somebody griping that technically a quorum was created.
And that is absolutely perfect. I mean, even the news media couldn't ask for more than that. I mean, if communities are thinking in those terms and just trying to be cognizant of it
Yep.
and be a little bit aware, and I think I've removed there's a particular case where exactly that was the occurrence. It was a township board, and inadvertently, or not necessarily inadvertently, but there was a majority of the township board at another meeting, and they were challenged, and they said, that's illegal under the Open Meetings Act. And my recollection is the judge said no, because they didn't exchange views, just because they were there. And actually, they were I think, speaking to the chair and through the chair, but they weren't exchanging views, and they weren't deliberating towards making a decision. So I think that's exactly what the intent of the act is, in a reasonable sense. I hope, did that help some? Okay. Okay, OMA, Open Meetings Act. Recall the impetus. There's Richard Milhouse. The basic intent of the act is to strengthen the right of all Michigan citizens to know what goes on in government by requiring public bodies to conduct nearly all business at open meetings. And as with FOIA, the courts take this very seriously. We do not countenance the use of strained legalisms or evasions to undermine the intent of the OMA to promote open, responsive government. So, unless there's one of the 6 specific exceptions, meetings of a public body shall be open to the public. Okay, that's easy enough. Decisions, and I think this is pretty easy too. When you make a decision, it needs to be, unless it's a closed session, well, I take it back. The decision actually has to be made in the open session. So all decisions have to be made at an open meeting. But then it gets a little tough. All deliberations of a public body constituting a quorum shall take place at a meeting open to the public. So all deliberations. So a meeting is subject to the OMA if it's a public body, and public bodies include committees and subcommittees. Meets with a quorum present, and I'll talk about constructive quorum, which is not in the act, but it was created by the judiciary, convened for the purpose of deliberating towards rendering a decision. It's not necessary that the public body intended that its deliberations would lead to a decision. And one of the important cases, a couple important cases early on after the acts were put in place, dealt with mini meetings and what some communities and the University of Michigan devised what was pretty clever but ultimately struck down plan, and they had less than quorum meetings where neither had enough of the council members to constitute a quorum. And the court held that since the 2-day total was enough for a quorum, the practice violated the Open Meetings Act. So that's constructive quorum, and the point is that the court said and ruled, and it is now the law, that if you're violating the intent, that you're in violation of the Open Meetings Act. So even if you don't physically have a quorum there. And in both of those instances, it was clear that the process was designed to circumvent the act. And that's what the court found, and that's why they struck it down. Deliberation, I mentioned that just deliberating towards making a decision is subject to the OMA. And here are a couple cases that speak to that. And it's a pretty broad definition. The act of carefully considering issues is enough. What about a consensus building process? If it equates to a decision making, it falls underneath the act. But of course, as soon as I say that, look at Moore versus Finville Board of Education, which kind of goes the other way. The Attorney General's Handbook, by the way, I would recommend the Attorney General's Handbook to you. It's available online. I've got the site in my materials somewhere. It's really good. It's very common sense, easy to understand. I think they do a very nice job on the OMA handbook. Anyway, around the horn process violates the OMA. As I mentioned before, if the majority of the council or board or commission are all together in a setting, you may be doing absolutely nothing wrong, but keep in mind the appearance. These are easy enough, and your manager and your clerk have this handled, but these are the rules with respect to the notice. There are different notice requirements concerning open meetings. In regard to the public comment, I mentioned the importance of the role of the presiding officer for the body, the public body. But these are the rules with respect to the public comment portion. You can have the public comment portion whenever you would like during the meeting. It could be at the beginning, the end, or more than one place. Some communities will have public comment after a particular agenda item that they know is the one that everybody is there for. If it's a controversial one, maybe you don't ask everybody to wait until the end of the meeting. You have public comment sooner. But that's up to you. You can modify what you're doing with respect to public comment as long as it's appropriately done prior to a meeting, so you can have a special rule. How long do you have for public comment here? 3 minutes? 5 minutes? Wowzer, okay. Some communities would say that's quite a bit, but if it works, it's up to you. But if you had 100 people at a council meeting, you could modify it for that council meeting and reduce it to 2 or 3. It's up to you. But the key is you can't set a limit on the total amount of time that the public speaks. You can limit each individual and the amount of time he or she speaks, but you cannot limit the total amount of time. So, and this gets back to, I don't want to reiterate this too much, but is the public comment portion supposed to be like a New England town hall meeting? And I would argue no. That's not what was envisioned. It's your meeting for the city council. This is your meeting. They have the opportunity to comment to you, but it is your meeting. With respect to closed sessions, and I'll get to the 6 exceptions where you can go into closed session, when a council member reveals what happened or what was said in a closed session, there are some difficulties that are created. By and large, if what the law says is that under section 7.2, if the minutes of a closed session are revealed, that is something that should not occur. That is something that is prohibited by the Act when the minutes of a closed session are revealed. And in addition to that, there are different city attorneys will have differing opinions on what else may be the case, but I would suggest that with respect to keeping information confidential from a closed session, that municipalities take a look or consider any sort of ethics ordinances or charter provisions you might have, council rules or codes of conduct, the Roberts Rules of Order, which would have an applicability, and I had mentioned before there are state ethics acts which might come into play. But again, by and large, revealing the minutes of a closed session is something that is specifically prohibited underneath the OMA law. Beyond that, it is up to interpretation, in my opinion, by the particular city, but again, you'd want to consult with your city attorney to get more direction on that. Here's an attempt at humor. Here is the media, and they are helping with transparency always. So, going into closed session, first, of course, you have to have a properly convened open meeting, and then you need a motion and a section and adoption to go into closed session. You need a majority vote if the purpose for going to the closed session is either discipline or collective bargaining. You need a majority vote. If it's one of the other 4 exceptions, which I'll mention in just a minute, it takes a 2/3 vote. In either case, I would suggest that you take a roll call vote to go into closed session, and that you make notation of the reason you're going into closed session, which one of the exceptions. I think that's a very good And then you're transparent, nobody has any concerns. So, number one, the 6 relevant reasons for a closed session. If requested, and if the council agrees, you can go into closed session to discuss something like a discipline or suspension or dismissal. And, you know, the legislature got this right. It makes sense. You don't want to embarrass anybody in public. So if the person requests and if the council agrees, then you can go into closed session to discuss that sort of matter. Sometimes an employee's contract requires it. It still doesn't mean that the council has to, because it's the council's choice, but if you don't, you may have you may be subject to a lawsuit. So keep that in mind. But in the end, as a practical matter, the subject person needs to be contacted ahead of time, unless you know that he or she will be at the meeting. And keep in mind that if you do properly go into closed session for this sort of a purpose, the person can rescind the request at any time. And if he or she does that, then the council needs to go back into open session. And you can continue if you wish or not, but you can't stay in closed session. This is interesting. The city attorney in Big Rapids posted this. I don't know how many cities would agree with this, but I think it's kind of interesting. He recommends using open sessions for these sorts of purposes. Even though you could go into closed session, he recommended staying in open session, and he argues that it tends to have a sanitizing effect on comments and discussions. It's more transparent, and he thinks overall it's worked better for his community to stay into open session for this type of a thing. But I'm not sure how many communities would agree with that one. Number 2, the second reason for going into closed session for strategy and negotiation sessions in regard to collective bargaining. Makes sense. Keep in mind that you can do this only if you're actually in negotiations or starting sometime soon. The third one is to purchase or lease real property, not for the sale. You can consult, the fourth one, consult with an attorney regarding specific pending litigation. It needs to be specific pending litigation. The fifth one is to review and consider contents of an application for employment if the candidate requests confidentiality. The interviews, once you get it narrowed down to the finalists, the interviews need to be held in a public meeting. And the sixth is to consider material exempt from discussion or disclosure by state or federal statute, a good example being FOIA. So if something is exempt under FOIA, then you could use that. A written, not an oral, a written opinion from your city attorney due to the attorney-client privilege under FOIA could be such an example. Security plans, obviously. An appraisal, same thing. So those are subject or exempt under FOIA, so therefore you could use that to make a closed session. You have to take a separate set of minutes for the OMA closed session. It can be the clerk or someone else, doesn't need to be the clerk. You can add people if you wish to the session, to a closed session. Let's say you need an architect or a realtor or an engineer, some sort of expertise. You could add that person in. You can destroy the minutes a year and a day later, which is interesting. Communications technology, we're back to smartphones. Keep the intent of the act in mind. Did the members of the public body just passively receive some emails or texts, or did they actively exchange emails showing an intent to deliberate? Be careful when you hit reply to all. This is from a recent school board text exchange. I learned that if I text 4 or more, I'm in violation of the Open Meetings Act, so I'll be texting 2 or 3 at a time. No. Also, if anyone needs to meet with administration, I need to know that's policy, thanks. So again, this is like the meeting where they broke into subgroups and never had a quorum. It's the same sort of a thing. The person was trying to do it through text messaging. You can't do that. What if a council member or the manager is sending out information to each one of the council members? That's fine, no problem, one way. What if the council member sends it out and number 2 sends a response back, number 3 a response back, like that? No problem. This is where the problem begins. And this is the danger of electronic communication, because let's say it's the manager sending out some information and the manager sends it to council member 5 and council member 5 sends it to council member 3 who then sends it to 2. You don't know with whom other council members are sharing it. It can be totally innocent. You don't know what sort of exchange is occurring. You don't want to read down 1,200, however many, a great number of back and forths. You lose sight of to whom these things are being sent. So it's important that you're careful in regard to sending your electronic communications, text or email, regardless of the sort of device that you're using, whether it's city or whether it's personal. One good way to do things is to send things through the manager. And then the manager can make sure that everybody gets it and everybody's on the same page. This is something else, excuse me, something else from the attorney's listserv, and one of the city attorneys posted, I've been asked to provide my city council with an opinion of the following scenario. To what extent can an elected council member post on social media on a personal Facebook account how the council member intends to vote? So if you're on Facebook and you are opposed to paving Elm Street, should you be posting, I'm going to vote no on repaving Elm Street? By the way, there's not a right or wrong answer on this one. I just think it's an interesting question in the context of electronic communication and social media. I mean, it's something, this is totally new in the sense of how to deal with the Open Meetings Act. So some of the responses included, one post by itself does not necessarily rise to the level of violation, but what if other council members post? And somebody else says, well, how is this different than that same council member going to the grocery store and telling people that he or she is going to vote no on paving Elm Street? How is that different? I mean, how can you restrict somebody's First Amendment right to express themselves? This is just another way of expressing oneself. And that's one line of thought, that the First Amendment protects your ability to express what you're going to do. And just because you're putting on your Facebook page, why is that a problem? Somebody else said, well, should a council member discuss such matters is probably a question of ethics. Maybe it's not ethical, but what a council member can post is a question of First Amendment rights. And that city attorney thought you should be able to do this. Again, is it any different than someone making a comment to someone at a coffee shop? The OMA isn't intended to restrict free speech. It's intended to prevent conduct of deliberations in smoke-filled rooms. Am I missing something? Well, my concern is, and one person's concern is, what you may be missing with that approach is, what if council members end up creating a parallel council meeting by the exchange of posts on a Facebook page, for instance? So council member 1 posts, I'm not going to vote yes on Elm Street because we can't afford it. And council member 2 posts, well, I agree that we can't afford it, so I'm inclined to vote the same way. And council member 3 posts, I'm going to vote no, but it's because I think Maple Street ought to be done first. Well, haven't you created a parallel council meeting in those sorts of posts? There's no right or wrong on this one. It's just something that all municipalities are dealing with now because a lot of people are very active on social media platforms. And it raises some really interesting, to me, very interesting questions on what you can and can't post. Somebody said, what if you start liking? What if council member 1 says, I'm going to vote no on repaving Elm Street because we can't afford it? If council member 2 puts an emoji that's a smiley face, is that, has he agreed and therefore it's deliberation? Have a headache yet? And the last word is noted in the Howell Court of Appeals decision. I mentioned the Howell School Board decision where it's more about what it is rather than where it is. The FOA, as well as the OMA, was written long before the 21st century communications. So I would suggest that you be cautious in what you're doing. I mentioned constructive quorums. Again, it's where the court infers or implies that there's an actual quorum. And that was used specifically in regard to we had sub-quorum meetings, especially where there was a less than quorum meeting of the council on Tuesday and another less than quorum meeting on Wednesday. The court said the two together constituted a quorum, inferred that there was a constructive quorum. And be careful in regard to delegation of authority. That's also important. You can have an advisory committee of some sort, even if there are no council members or administrators on it. If the authority to make the ultimate decision has been delegated to that group, that can constitute something that needs to be subject to the OMA. In regard to remedies and consequences, the action in question may be invalidated. That's the key one. And also, again, the disclosure of the minutes of a closed session is something that is specifically prohibited by the Act. Okay, we're starting to get towards the end of our time. Here are a few OMA questions from cases. The first one is, let's say the mayor contacts each council member to find out his or her position on the city manager before the manager's status is reviewed at a regularly scheduled council meeting. So the question is, doesn't this violate the Open Meetings Act? The mayor called up each council member and asked him or her whether or not the manager's contract should be renewed. And shouldn't that violate the Open Meetings Act? And the court said no. And the reason is because the mayor, when he called council member 1 and got an answer and then called council member 2, he didn't tell 2 what 1 had said and he didn't tell 3 what 1 or 2 had said. It was taking a poll, and the court ruled that that was okay. It would have been a different result had the mayors basically deliberated towards making a decision by telling council members, well, 1 and 2 said we should retain the manager. If he had said that to 3, then he would have been basically deliberating towards having a decision made. What if several members of a public body enough for a quorum remain after an open meeting to engage in informal discussion? And somebody said, we are violating the Open Meetings Act. The court said, no. Apparently the court was either satisfied with the testimony or heard a transcript perhaps or a tape recording, that there was no deliberation by a quorum of the remaining board members. So there was no violation. Again, they were in City Hall, they were city council members, but the content of what they were talking about was not city business, according to the court. Therefore, it's not a violation. What if 3 members of a 7-member Park and Rec board actively exchanged thoughts and plans via email on how to handle public policy matters that were going to come before the board? So you've got 3 members of a body are shooting emails back and forth. A 4th member just received the emails. The 4th member didn't respond to any of them. Somebody said that's a violation of the Open Meetings Act, and the court said, yes and yes, by all 4. And I think what the court probably felt was that when they took the votes, guess what? All 4 members voted the same way. So even though the 4th person was trying to not make it a quorum by not responding, that 4th person was receiving those emails. The 4th person never said, don't send me any more emails. He or she continued to receive them. And so that was sufficient deliberation towards making a decision. And I think the evidence was probably the way they voted in each instance. What about study sessions? We aren't making any decisions. Those will be made at the next regular council meeting. Do we have to make those, post those as open meetings? And the answer is yes, you should, because why take the risk? And I think you guys already do this appropriately. Just make them open meetings. Have a little bit of time for public comment at the end, or whenever you wish, and take some minutes, and you're covered. So if you do happen to start deliberating towards making a decision, it's not a problem. This is a case fairly recent about a city that had the study sessions in a different room than the council chamber. It was a smaller room. It was noticed as an open meeting, but it created in this person's mind the implication that it was not open to the public. And the city attorney was asking, how can I deal with this? And it was an appearance thing. Again, it was formally noticed as an open meeting, but it was in a different, smaller room, and this person, at least member of the public at least, felt that he or she was either precluded or not welcome. And so I think what the city was going to do is take steps to make sure that everybody understood that it was an open meeting, even though it was called a study session. There's no right or wrong on this one, but what should a council member who is abstaining say that you have a financial, there's a financial implication in what the council needs to vote on that evening, and you announce that at the beginning. It's always good to announce at the beginning that you have a conflict, explain what the conflict is, and that you will not be able to vote on this matter. Different cities go different directions with respect to what extent should you participate in the meeting at all. I don't know how you handle that here, but
Typically, the council member will announce whatever conflict exists, and our practice is they'll actually ask permission to abstain from the vote. Typically, they will also then abstain from any discussion on the topic.
I think that's a good way to go.
It's pretty rare.
Yeah. Okay. So, and I think that's probably what most cities would do, abstain from discussing things. Some city attorneys or some communities would feel that it's appropriate for the council member to leave the dais, actually. Some would even argue leaving the room. I think that's rare, however. So again, appearance. Oh, this is the one I mentioned. It is still in here, where the township supervisor addresses the planning commission with enough other township board members in attendance to equal a quorum. And in this case, the court ruled it was not a violation because the supervisor's comments did not constitute deliberations, and so long as the board members did not exchange any affirmative or opposing views. So they didn't basically discuss anything. They were hearing what the supervisor said, but they weren't discussing it or deliberating. And I'll make this the last example. It's fairly recent from a community a ways north of here on Lake Michigan. And this was on the municipal attorney's listserv, and the city attorney was wondering, how should we deal with this? There was a closed session, and there was evidence that one of the council members taped the meeting. And near the end of the session, the council person's purse started to play. They assumed that she had accidentally hit the button turning off the record feature and started playing what was recorded. The council member had said, no, she didn't do that. She wasn't taping the meeting, but they had elected officials yelling back and forth with all sorts of interesting adjectives. They agreed that after the meeting concluded, the vice mayor would listen to what was recorded, and that would be the resolution of it. Well, then the council member who did the recording refused to do that, further argument and name calling. The council member whom probably taped the closed session does not get along with any of the other council members beyond changing procedures to prevent future taping of closed sessions. What does the elected body do? And these are some of the responses from other city attorneys. Conduct all future sessions in the nude. With or without purses, that would definitely solve one problem. That would just make the video go viral. And then somebody else said he was leaving. It made him laugh out loud. I think it was a Friday afternoon when this one was posted. So aside from the humor, I think maybe the answer to this is that the council member probably didn't break any laws unless she discloses the tape to third parties. But is that a good way to build rapport with your colleagues on council? I would suggest not. So again, it probably wasn't any sort of a violation of law, but it was something that would be very damaging to the relationship with her colleagues on the council. And I think that's where they left it. And I will leave that here. Again, the policy to strengthen the right of all Michigan citizens to know what goes on in government by requiring public bodies to conduct nearly all business at open meetings. So unless there's one of those 6 exceptions, you need to conduct things in open sessions, and then be very careful how you go into closed sessions, and then how they are conducted, how you come out of them properly, and keeping things confidential that are within the closed sessions. Unless there are any questions, I am going to, actually, I'm going to be completely done. There was supposed to be a video at the end of this, but I think unfortunately there isn't. So I'm going to conclude. If there are any questions, I would love to take them. Otherwise,
I have one.
Mr. Mayor, it's up to you.
Being on the council, we're lucky enough to have the staff there, so we don't drift into the wilderness too often with the Open Meeting Act. But I've been on councils when we've had just a single staff member who is new and maybe not well versed. So, could you give us some bullet points that when we walk out of here, we ought to know, 1, 2, or 3 things about, don't do this in Open Meeting Acts, or please make sure you do this in OMA, those kinds of things.
The first thing I would say, I'm not answering your questions directly, but the first thing I would say is you ought to be proud of what you have here in this community. Be proud of it. You deserve it. It's a terrific place. Secondly, you need to think about the technology, which is so incredibly valuable, but also can cause problems. It's so easy to communicate now. Be very careful with respect to both FOIA and OMA in using electronic communication, because it's instantaneous. It can go to everywhere. It can go to anyone, and it can go to people that you're not anticipating. So you need to be concerned about the fact that you might be creating a meeting, a deliberation towards making a decision by the exchange of an email or a text that you never intended to occur. And I think it's the same thing in regard to the Freedom of Information Act. Just be careful. I would, in terms of your communications, it would be easier if you're having your manager help you out in managing those, and so everybody's on the same page, and you know the sorts of things that are going around. So I think the key is to be concerned about inadvertent creating of deliberating towards making a decision when you really didn't want to. That's number one, and obviously protect confidential information, and that's about it. And you've got good staff, and you've got a good city attorney, so you're going to be fine.
Anybody else?
This is more of a question for Brian. Brian, does the city have a policy on social media and maintenance of the city's webpage?
Yeah, so we maintain an active social media presence. What we don't do is any type of debates. If we receive questions via social media, we'll attempt to respond directly to the individual. But every Friday, we will post anywhere from 3 to up to a dozen stories that are generally taken from staff memos. We try to get as much information out, but what we refrain from is allowing those debates to start raging via Facebook or whatever. So we do respond to questions, but we try to respond directly to that person. Occasionally, we are unable to do that just due to lack of contact information. So to answer your question, yes, and then I tried to give you some examples on how we embrace that social media policy.
Brian, is it like one person that's doing that, or is it a committee, or like one person and then it's subject to the city manager's approval or something like that?
Yeah, so for the general city, we have one person doing the posting. That person is backed up occasionally by the city clerk, will help out. But everything that is posted, I've had a chance to look at. Everything from job postings to news releases, etc. For police and fire, those are also active pages that ultimately they have individuals assigned to do the postings, and then the two chiefs have sign-off authority. If you haven't had a chance, South Haven Area Emergency Services is probably the most active fire service on social media. We're really blessed to have a local volunteer who he wears a beeper. He goes to all calls and actually will grab images, drone photography, standard photography, and all that stuff gets posted. Occasionally, we'll get some complaints about, if a face is seen, we try really hard to be sensitive to that in the event of an accident, but it is something that we keep a very close eye on. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yep.
Anybody else? The PowerPoint is on the website already, in case you haven't seen it. It's there, so it's already there. All right. If no other questions, thank you very much for coming, for your time. Always enlightening, so thank you for coming. Thanks, everybody, for showing up, and I will seek a motion to adjourn.
I make a motion that we adjourn.
Second.
Motion and second to adjourn. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned. Thanks, everybody.